With your shield in hand and a whole lot of necrosis stacks, the warrior can transform into an absolute menace, and it all starts with the right build. My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and today we're speccing into the Reaper, mastering the art of the undead, and taking the fight to the darkspawn in Dragon Age the Veilguard. When it comes to the warrior, melee will always be king, so leave it to Schmo to find a build that takes the class in a completely opposite direction. Just like our mage build, we're building this warrior at level 40 once the entire specialization tree becomes available, and like before, you can start building this during progression, it just won't be as potent. With that in mind, let's dive into the skills and build out this Reaper warrior build. We're going to take this one skill at a time, and I'll pause if any specific skill needs more explanation to better help you understand how this build comes together. To start, we'll take Shield Volley, a necessity with this build, giving your shield toss the ability to volley between enemies up to 3 times. Next is Rancor, a greater passive that delays the decay of rage. Then we have our first ability, Spectral Bulwark. This will be essential during progression, especially while you're figuring out Veilguard's combat, but as you get more confident in your offense, this will be replaced by another ability. After that, we'll pick up Enraged, which increases our rage generation by 10%. Then we'll pick up an interesting one, Explosive Toss. This gives us the ability to charge up our shield and then throw out an explosive variant that deals AoE damage and disrupts most enemy attacks, a useful bit of utility early on. Next, we'll take Providence and then Ensuing Rage, which is a nice rage management skill that keeps our reserves relatively safe. Then we'll take Insidious Rot, our first skill that increases our necrotic stacks. After that, we'll take our second ability, Deadly Ground. This creates a necrotic field at the warrior's location, dealing constant damage to enemies inside the area, while also granting you enhanced damage while you're inside that field. Next, we'll take Death's Blessing for a flat 10% necrotic damage boost. Then we'll pick up Seething Pitch, which gives our shield toss the ability to generate rage, with a bonus if the toss hits a weak spot. After that, we'll take Mortal Wounds, which increases our weak spot damage. Next, we'll pick up the ability Bloody Advance. This is a projectile that impales enemies, but there is a twist. Throwing a charged shield at a still impaled enemy will cause it to burst, dealing AoE damage to enemies nearby. After that, we'll take Master Throw, which gives our shield toss an extra layer of charge, increasing its damage. Then we'll take Ricochet Shot, which grants our shield toss an additional bounce. Next, we'll take Ignition, which grants Flaming Weapon after defeating an enemy with a weak point hit. Flaming weapons deal 25% increased damage. Now, honestly, this is not a big part of the build, but necessary given our pathing. We'll follow that up with Enervation, which grants plus 20% damage versus barriers. Then we'll take Eclectic Armor. While wearing different classifications of your helm and armor, Shield Toss will gain 2 additional bounces, and range and weak spot damage will be increased by 15%. After that, we'll take Desolate Malady, which increases affliction damage by 10%. Next, we'll take Staggering Toss, which converts 25% of your current rage into stagger when you shield toss. Then we'll scoop up Improved Throw for a 10% increase to shield toss damage. After that, we'll take Return to Sender, which allows us to send back projectiles towards the attacker with a perfect defense. Next, we'll take Necessary Steps, which grants a 20% increase to primer duration. And then Masochism, which grants 4 rage whenever we take damage. After that, we'll want Improved Health for a passive HP increase, as well as Depth of Fury for a maximum rage increase. From here, we'll pick up our specialization Reaper and every talent available as part of that specialization. We'll start with our ultimate, Spirit Storm. This is a massive whirlwind move that deals necrotic damage and pulls targets towards the vortex. Damage is also siphoned to the warrior, allowing them to heal. Then we'll take the spec-specific ability, Reaper. This conjures a giant ethereal scythe that hits targets in melee range, dealing necrotic damage, detonating prime targets, while also applying Siphon. After that, we'll take Death's Blessing for an increase to necrotic damage. And then Reckless Shot, which increases the damage of projectile abilities at the cost of some health. This enhances the earlier mentioned Bloody Advance ability. Next, we'll take Death's Throw, which converts our shield toss damage to necrotic. Then we'll pick up Invigoration, which increases the effectiveness of Leech by 20%. After that, we'll grab Living Decay, giving all necrotic damage 50% penetration, while also restoring 2% of our health. Next, we'll take Desperation, which grants a damage bonus relative to the amount of health you and your target have lost. Then we'll scoop up Devastation, increasing our ability damage and duration. After that is an interesting one, Death's Touch. While any duration ability is active, in our case Reaper and Bloody Advance, charged attacks also apply necrosis to enemies. Next we'll grab Perfect Throw, which adds a fun minigame component to a charged shield toss, giving the attack potentially more damage. Getting close to the end here, we'll then take Shattering Throw, which increases shield toss damage and increases our bounces yet again. Then there's Spirit of Hunger. When you kill an enemy, a necrotic projectile tracks and damages a nearby target. And finally, we take Let It Linger, which grants your shield toss the ability to apply an affliction based on the shield's damage type. With our skills locked in, it's time to talk gear. Of course, that's a huge part of any build, but we wanted our builds to really focus on the skills. So with each gear category, we're going to focus on overarching principles or guidelines that will give you just a bit of flexibility while gearing your Reaper. Believe it or not, your main hand weapon only plays a supporting role in this build, but while not the star, it is still a factor. We opt for the Woodsong Cleaver, which focuses on rage generation, allowing us to use abilities more often. This specific weapon also has the added bonus of dealing additional damage to barriers and armor both. This works because it fills in the gaps that our skills otherwise don't focus on. In the case of this build, we don't take a lot of skills that deal extra damage to barriers and armor, so this particular weapon synergizes well, but others that are similar would likewise. As far as our two-hander is concerned, well, you just won't be using it to attack pretty much ever. When your two-hander is out, you don't have access to your shield toss, effectively negating the build we're focusing on, so it's best to use this weapon to provide passive benefits with the understanding that you'll never actually pull it out and start swinging. Bottom line, avoid anything that increases or enhances the weapon's damage and focus on more overarching bonuses. Now, as far as our shield goes, well, this is obviously an important choice as shield toss is such a huge part of the build. Obviously, you want something that's going to enhance that aspect of your build. For example, we run with Necropolis Defender, which leans into both the necrotic elements of the build as well as increasing the number of bounces, two things that fit the build makeup nicely. Across the rest of your gear, what you're looking for are a few key things, and we can actually keep this relatively simple. Rage generation is great as it directly contributes to how often you can use your abilities, and thus apply stacks of necrosis. Anything that increases necrotic damage is also a safe bet. As you'll come to find out with this build, necrosis ends up being the driving force behind most of the damage, so the more you can just juice that, the better. Then we'll want to focus on anything that's going to enhance your shield toss, be it bounces, damage, affliction application, you name it. Anything that falls outside of those three guidelines doesn't make it outright bad, but might not enhance the damage potential of the build quite as much. The last piece to this Reaper build are the runes. Remember, each rune has an active and a passive buff, and it's the benefit of all three together that you have to think about. We'll start with Toss, which is an obvious choice for this build. Passively, it grants +1 to our shield toss bounce, but when activated, it allows us to shield toss with virtually no cooldown. That's an insane amount of damage and potential necrosis stacking. The second rune is Scourge, which passively increases necrotic damage. When activated, all your weapons deal necrotic damage for 20 seconds. Now, while nice, we're not really using the active effect here. Finally, there's Upend, which passively increases all resistances by 5%. What's more interesting is the active effect. When used, all of your defensive resistances become offensive damage bonuses of the same type. So, if you have a high percentage of necrotic resistances, while this rune is active, that resistance turns into a necrotic damage bonus, which can be insane depending on how much resistance you actually have. On paper, this build might not make a whole lot of sense. You see things like shield bounces and necrotic damage, and it's hard to fathom just how powerful it can be when put to the test. The key is to stack necrosis. That's your damage over time effect that's applied by practically everything you do, from throwing your shield to using your abilities. Because of the skill setup, you're going to see each tick of necrosis deal an absurd amount of damage, and because you have excellent necrotic penetration, the damage will also chew through barriers and armor with little to no issue. What you're looking at on screen is an endgame warrior, and while nice, you won't be this powerful until later in the game. So you will have to rely on your abilities and potentially your weapon to help clean up any remaining enemies. Your first instinct should be to survey the landscape and begin a shield toss charge before any sort of engagement. This ensures you can attack right out of the gate. If you're far enough out, you can even get off a second charge shield toss. Then, after you've tossed a couple shields, you can clean up whatever enemies are left over with your core abilities. The Croesus is going to do most of the damage, but your abilities can also keep stacks high so that the damage over time keeps rolling in. When all else fails, you always have your melee weapons, which is quite honestly your last resort with this setup. Trust me when I say you won't really need them, but it's nice to have when there are a few low health enemies lingering around. What's unique about this Reaper build is that it doesn't play like a traditional warrior. In fact, I don't know exactly what you'd call this playstyle. Perhaps an undead Captain America is the closest comparison I can draw, and while ridiculous, you can't argue with the results. So there you have it, our Reaper warrior build for Dragon Age the Veilguard. If you like this build, be sure to check out our Spellblade Mage build already released on the channel. And of course, if you appreciate everything that goes into making these guides, do me a solid, hit that thumbs up, and consider subscribing. My name is Cody Atkin from everyone here at Legacy Gaming. Thanks for watching, and play on.